All right, so get this. You see a story about a protest online, right? In the comments, it's like everyone's ready to go to war with each other. How can people watch the same thing and have such different like takeaways, you know?
Yeah, it's like everyone's bringing their own special decoder ring to the table.
Totally.
And that's actually what we're diving into today. We're going to try to unpack Stuart Hall's encoding decoding model.
Okay.
And trust me, this isn't just some dusty old theory. It really shapes how we see the world, whether
Yeah.
it's the news, advertisements, or even just like a text message from a friend.
So no more assuming everyone's on the same page, even if we're looking at the same thing.
Exactly.
I'm into it.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with this whole encoding and decoding thing?
Well, at its heart, it's really about recognizing that communication, it isn't a straight line from sender to receiver. It's more like a dance. Both sides kind of bring their own moves to the table.
Oh, okay.
Um, and Hall uses these terms encoding and decoding to describe this process.
All right, so break it down for me. What does it actually mean to encode a message?
Okay, so imagine you're a news producer, right? You're putting together a segment on, let's say, a new economic policy. You're making choices the whole way through, like what footage do we use, who do we interview, even just like what words are we going to use to describe the policy. All those choices, they encode the message with a specific meaning, even if you're not trying to.
So even if you're aiming for objectivity, the way you frame a story like inherently has a perspective baked in.
Absolutely, and that's just one side of it. On the receiving end, you have the viewer or the decoder, and they're not just passively absorbing all this. They're actively trying to make sense of it through their own experiences, their values, their beliefs.
So like going back to that protest example, one person sees chaos, they see danger, someone else sees people passionately fighting for what they believe in. Same footage, but like a totally different decoding happening.
Precisely. And this is where things get even more interesting. Hall argues that there isn't always this perfect symmetry, you know, between what the sender intends, the encoding, and how the receiver actually interprets it, the decoding.
Which explains why sometimes it feels like things get lost in translation or maybe even deliberately twisted.
Exactly, and this is where his concept of polysemy comes in. It's a fancy way of saying that messages can be interpreted in a bunch of different ways.
Okay, I need an example. Give me polysemy in action.
Okay, think about like a popular song, right?
Yeah.
The artist encodes it with their meaning, their experiences, but people listening might connect with it on a whole other level, bringing in their own experiences, their own interpretations. There's no one right answer.
Or like a movie that sparks completely different conversations depending on who you watch it with.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's actually different from what we call pluralism, which is just the idea that like multiple viewpoints exist. Polysemy is about the message itself. Like it has the potential for multiple meanings, even if those weren't the ones the creator intended.
Okay, so this is blowing my mind a little bit here. How do we know which interpretation is right then?
Well, that's the thing. There isn't always one right answer.
Mm.
Hall argued that our interpretations, they're influenced by what he called the dominant cultural order, the values, the beliefs, even the ideologies that are kind of floating around in a society.
So it's like those messages that we see all the time in the media from family institutions, it all kind of seeps into how we see things, even if we don't realize it.
Exactly. And that shared background is actually what makes certain readings of a message way more likely than others.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the bigger picture. We're not just decoding messages in isolation. We're doing it in this giant web of social and cultural influences.
Exactly. And understanding those influences, that's key to becoming more critical about the information that's coming at us all the time.
Huh.
But before we get into that, let's dive into Hall's 3 decoding positions. This is where it gets really interesting.
3D coding positions, huh? All right, you've really got me intrigued here. It's like we're about to unlock these like secret levels of understanding or something.
Yeah. Think of it more like trying on different pairs of glasses,
Yeah.
Each position is like a different way of seeing and understanding a message.
Okay, I like that. So what's the first pair of glasses we're trying on?
So the first one, probably the most straightforward one, is the dominant hegemonic position.
Okay.
And this is where you, as the decoder, you're basically just accepting the intended meaning. Like you're totally vibing with what the encoder put out there. You're seeing eye to eye, the whole thing.
So using our protest example, this would be someone watching the news and just agreeing with how they framed the story, like no questions asked.
Exactly. They're not really looking at it critically. They're just taking it as Like, this is reality, this is truth.
Yeah, which makes sense, especially if it already lines up with what they believe, like it's easy to go with the flow when it's confirming what you already think.
Right, but then it gets a little more interesting with the next position, the negotiated code.
Okay.
This is where you might agree with the overall message, but you add your own, like, spin to it based on your own experiences.
So you see the main point, but you're not afraid to, like, make a few tweaks here and there to make it fit your own view of the world.
Exactly. Imagine, like, reading an article about small business owners, right, and the challenges they face.
Yeah.
You might agree with, like, the general idea, but if you've ever run your own business, you'd be bringing this whole other level of understanding to it.
You might say, yeah, they're right about that, BUT. And then you add in your own experience.
Exactly. And this negotiated position, it's probably the most common one, actually.
Yeah.
We're always kind of filtering things through our own lives, right?
Yeah.
Adding our own little interpretations to the mix.
It's like we're all remixing the messages we see, creating these personalized versions.
And then we've got the third one, the oppositional code.
Okay.
This is where it gets really interesting. This is when you just totally reject the intended meaning of the message.
Whoa, okay. Talk about shaking things up.
Yeah.
So we're not just adding our own spin here. We are straight up disagreeing with the core of what the message is.
You got it. Imagine like a commercial that uses those really harmful stereotypes. Someone decoding that oppositionally would recognize those stereotypes and just challenge them head on. They're rejecting the whole message.
So they're not just changing the channel, they're calling out the problem and like offering a different way to see it.
Exactly. They understand that dominant message, but they're pushing back against it. They see the flaws in it.
This is so powerful. It's like you're not just passively taking in information anymore. You're actively part of shaping the narrative.
And that's the beauty of this whole model. It lets us see that we have a choice in how we understand the world. We're not just like empty vessels. We bring our own experiences and values to the table.
So what you're saying is there's no one right way to decode something. It all depends on you, the decoder, and the context.
Exactly. And the more aware we are of these different positions, the better we become at navigating this crazy world of communication. We can start to see why people see things so differently and have better conversations, even when we disagree.
Okay, I'm starting to really see how this all connects, but how do we even know which decoding position we're using at any given time? Are we like making a choice, or is it more subtle than that?
That's a great question. And it gets to how these positions actually work in our lives. Sometimes it is a conscious choice. We might be like actively critiquing an article or disagreeing with a friend.
Yeah, but like, hold on, let's unpack this a little bit.
Exactly. But other times it's happening under the surface. We don't even realize we're filtering everything through our own biases and experiences.
It's like our brains are hardwired to decode the world in a way that makes sense to us, even if it means adding our own 2 cents or just rejecting something that doesn't fit with what we already think. It's like we're all walking around with these invisible filters, shaping how we experience everything.
Precisely. And that's why getting these decoding positions is so important. It's not even just about media. It's about understanding ourselves and where we fit in the world.
Okay, so big picture here. How does this actually play out in our everyday lives? Give me some real world examples here.
Okay, think about the last time you had a real disagreement with someone, maybe about like a news story or a political issue. Chances are you were both coming at it from totally different decoding positions, right? Like maybe you were in that dominant hegemonic mode, just taking the information as it was given.
Mm-hmm.
But the other person, they were like full-on negotiated or even oppositional.
Right, so instead of just talking past each other, if we could recognize those different positions, it could actually help us have a better conversation.
Exactly. It's like you can start to see where they're coming from, even if you don't agree with their conclusion. You get the why behind it.
Like, oh, I see why you see it that way, given what you've experienced and what you value.
Exactly. And that opens the door to empathy, to a better conversation overall.
This is wild. It's like you're giving me this whole toolkit for navigating this whole world of information out there.
And it's not just about chatting with your friends, right? It helps you become a more critical consumer of all media. Like next time you're watching the news, reading an article, scrolling online, anything, ask yourself, what decoding position am I in right now? Am I just letting this wash over me, or am I really engaging with it,
Be more mindful, basically, more aware of the stuff that's shaping what we see.
Exactly. We all have our biases, right? And those biases, they color how we see everything around us.
Okay, I'm convinced this encoding/decoding model It's a game changer. It's like you're giving me X-ray vision into how communication really works.
And the best part is, once you start seeing the world through this lens, you can't unsee it. It changes the way you deal with information, with media, with each other,
Yeah.
you know?
This has been such an insightful deep dive, but before we wrap up, I have one last question for you. If our interpretations are so subjective, like we're all bringing our own stuff to the table, can we ever really understand each other?
Uh-huh. That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And while Hall's model doesn't give us any easy answers, it does give us a way to understand how messy communication really is. Like, meaning, isn't this fixed thing? It's fluid, it's negotiated, right? And maybe that's a good place to start, you know? Just acknowledging that we all see things a little differently, and those differences, they're what make conversations and life so interesting.
That's a wrap on today's deep dive into Stuart Hall's encoding/decoding model. We've looked at how our experiences, what we believe, even the dominant cultural order, it all shapes how we understand the world around us. Remember, every interaction, every bit of media you encounter, it's a chance to put on those decoding glasses and uncover the layers of meaning underneath. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations flowing.